says that the powers that be, are desperately afraid of a massive global political awakening, which they fear will occur in the year 2009. And so that's actually manifesting. The language is now coming out pretty much as we said, which it was going to hit in midsummer. And it actually will be accompanied by an actual loss of control. Now, we can think of the control that comes from the powers that be as falling into one of three broad categories: mind or propaganda control, so it's the press or the media, the economic level, and then the military level. So the powers that be are in the process of losing their grip on the populace through one of those three arms, which means a couple of different things, actually, in terms of how we wish to interpret that. If they lost, for instance, propaganda control and everybody awakened, then they would be forced to exert economic and very harsh military control to keep everybody in line. Sure, the snippet of the speech is actually still available on YouTube, and you can hunt for Zbigniew Brzezinski and should be able to pick that up. It was recently posted. And basically what the issue is from the powers that be viewpoint, as is determined by our software, is that they are facing stresses in their three levels of control over a population at the same time that the population is getting, shall we say, restive in the sense of not being couch potatoes anymore, and is starting to have more and more people become awake, and thus putting even more pressure on their control systems. And you note, for instance, past few years, the abysmal ratings that the propaganda channels have. It's more and more people becoming aware and dropping the television and other forms of propaganda, and the powers that be are quite disturbed by this, because it means their mind control has to work harder on fewer and fewer people in order to maintain the status quo. And they are actually exhibiting signs of strain about if their use of military and economic force will be successful. They've actually crossed a fear threshold within our data set, and they are no longer assured within themselves. Some of them are even probably starting to admit it to themselves, that they will be able to retain control as we progress through these next few years.
You said they will be able to.
No, they are afraid that they will be able to. They are no longer assured that they will be able to maintain control. They are afraid that they will lose control at one level at a critical juncture and not be able to regain it. And in their viewpoint, everything would cascade from there.
Is there a nexus point that the WebBot is picking up on in terms of what could cause this loss of control? Are you seeing that in your data analysis?
We're seeing several, actually. And this is their problem. From our viewpoint, looking at it from the bottom up, so to speak, we're seeing that the pressures within their structure of continuous mind control on everyone daily, that is to say television and radio and other mainstream media, is failing rapidly. The powers that be have been taken aback and are extremely shocked by the rapid rise of independent media and the huge amount of following that it's getting. Mostly unreported, again, in the mainstream media, so they don't want to be reinforcing there. They also have problems with the current level of economic chaos. They knew it was coming, they had their plans in place to deal with it, and it is not going according to plan. The third element that they have is the issue of cascading military issues relative to energy, again, which is economic. So at this point, you have a lot of people running around, for instance, that are expressing fear language as to whether or not the U.S. military is going to come along and invade, in essence, be brought back from and invade the homeland and be used to garrison the American population. And there may be legitimate concerns about some of that at a very small level, but technically the powers that be are very much afraid that they would even have to do the smallest act in that regard because it would show how weak they are. And so we're seeing many of these nexus points. I actually think it'll be the press from some weird data that's within the real science fiction end of things in our work, as though it all isn't. I think that the press element will.
We're going to have to hold that right there. Before we get into that, let's pick up on the press. We're headed for the top of the hour break.
Sure.
Cliff, as we went to the break, you were talking about some of the countermeasures that the powers that be might try to keep a grip on us, including sending the troops home to garrison the United States. You want to pick that up from there?
Sure. That is an expressed fear. You see it out and about. It shows up in our archives, and we pick it up as a recurring meme. Personally, I know from history that it's unlikely to occur, and even if they brought all the troops home, they would need to actually have between 30 million and 60 million people on the street in uniform in order to garrison a country of 300 million. The Chinese, who are composed of 160 ethnic groups, are dominated by the Han Chinese. The Han Chinese ethnic group has for probably centuries known that they needed to maintain at least 20% population in order to garrison. So in the case of Tibet, for instance, what do they do after they take over? They immediately start moving in population until they reach about 20% Han Chinese relative to the rest of the population. Then they can think that they're relatively secure. So that would have to be done in the U.S. There are also other issues relative to the powers that be in the concept of the Illuminati, the greater, if you will, pan-international problem that we all face. Because the issue is not merely the political structure within the U.S. It's dominated by the Queen of England's group as well as the Club of Rome. And you notice who Obama and Bush all have to go and bow and kowtow to. Right now, Obama's making the same route that Bush did. First you go and kiss the Queen's hymn, and then you go kiss the Pope's ring to assure them that you have allegiance to their goals. So that's really the issue there. Now, the American populace, within the structure of our data, is going to present a whole series of problems to the powers that be beginning this fall when the economy and the dollar goes basically bluey. It's just going to sort of all dissolve on us in a relatively short period of time.
In what form? Are we going to see hyperinflation, bank closures?
We will see hyperinflation. We'll see banks closing. We'll see massive layoffs. We'll see corporate restructurings en masse. We may get to the point where we're reaching 50% or greater unemployment, and essentially the only people that are employed are in some form of government work, because at the moment we're almost there. The government controls all of the stock market. Mostly it's government dollars being recirculated that causes all of the churn that you see. Has been that way for years. It's creeping up to the point where 90+% of all the trades are done through computer orders, and it's at that point that you can mask everything. So the government has basically been running their monopoly money through itself over and over and over again, and we've digested just about everything we can out of those little bits of paper. And when it goes, it's going to cause a whole series of ripples, according to our data. That will actually enforce the already large awakening movement within the populace. Now, let's be real clear about this. The British government in the 1700s knew that they had lost the American Revolution before the war even started, because they realized that some 3% of the colonists were opposed to the monarchy. And once you reach a little bit about over 2%, then basically the power structure is at real risk. And we're rapidly approaching that.
Let's pick that up there right after the break, Cliff. We were going to the break. You were going to make a comparison between the discontent with the English crown in pre-revolutionary days to what could be happening here in America and what the WebBot says about all that.
Still there?
I'm here.
Yeah.
Did I? Go ahead, Cliff.
As I say, there's many historical studies that will point out that in military thinking, anytime a general populace goes to about 2 to 3% of the populace being against the ruling collective, whatever that may be at the time, then pretty much that ruling collective is on its way out. It's merely a matter of time. And in this case, we were looking at 2% of the pre-revolutionary war populace had decided that they just couldn't live under the taxation and all the other issues that were arising from the British control at that time. And that was when, I think that was actually 3 years before the outbreak of the war itself. But essentially the war would have been fought, could have been lost, and the revolution still could have been won up to that point. Of course, I'm, struck by the irony that Obama goes and bows to the Queen yet today, and supposedly we were done with that a few hundred years back. Leaving that aside, we know the powers that be in general, that is to say the Illuminati or however you want to think of them, the Bilderbergers, are facing a similar situation now with a population that's now spread across many different countries. For instance, you notice the issues they've had recently with Ireland and the Irish populace basically saying no to the Lisbon Treaty, which is a rewrite of the EU Constitution, which couldn't pass. And so we see that a lot of the power structures that the powers that be had tried to put in place are failing. They're aware that it's failing. They know that some of these issues will never arise in spite of the many attempts to hype them into existence through fear and other manipulation techniques. Well, let's take, for instance, the economy, the issue of gold, silver, and the mythical amaro and currency. Our data shows the dollar will collapse, of course, over the course of a complete year almost, from November 4th of this year, 2009, through all of remainder of 2009 and all of 2010 up to about November 2nd. It'll take almost that long for the dollar to completely go away as a reserve currency and also basically as the currency for the U.S. This is going to cause huge problems. But the plan of doing the amaro, which had been touted and leaked out repeatedly and trial ballooned any number of different ways over the past decade, is basically failed. It's a non-starter. None of the things that were required for it to be in existence as an effective alternative to the dollar exist yet today, and the powers that be know that even if they were to print billion dollars worth or billion amaros tomorrow and hand out amaro coins all over, it would take nearly 15 years to get any kind of confidence in the currency. Same issue that faced the euro. So now they are looking at this total loss of control as the dollar goes away as a global reserve, and we're seeing the rumbles now. India came out yesterday or today and said that they're thinking that the dollar is such a neat thing to put their storehouse of wealth in. There's just green pieces of paper backed by a failing government with an unstable political structure, over 1,000 military bases in 150 countries around the world, can't pay its debt, and directly owes about five times the gross domestic product of the planet. So all of the Americans all 300 million of us would have to work, I think, for nearly 150 years to pay off the debt as it exists now. And that's to the rest
Well, I think if I read that right, and I know where you're coming from with these figures, because you're talking about some of these hedge funds that were leveraged.
The derivatives,
and, yeah,
correct.
You get into, the derivatives market, you get into $1 quadrillion, basically, and that's 65 times the wealth of the planet. And I think I read each person's share, or each person's share is $143,000 here in this country. Is that about what you hear?
Yeah, that's about correct, and it's growing by the minute. So it's beyond ludicrous. I mean, it is beyond the course of too big to fail. It's too big to survive. It is such a huge beast that it can no longer draw breath anymore, and it's shuddering in its last dying gasps. And our data shows those gasps of the derivative markets starting around the 15th of July and running their course through the 22nd of August. So, and much of that will be in the background. We won't really be aware of it as just regular guys walking around, buying gas and trying to get groceries. But in the background, the derivative market is just going to come to a screeching halt and go through some real huge turmoil. This will produce a wave, if you will, of economic malaise that will show up in the markets probably early August, much more malaise and downbeat expressions than we're seeing now. But bear in mind the markets are manipulated casinos, and anybody would be a fool to have any resources whatsoever in any paper-denominated form that is tied back to the dollar, the U.S. government, or the stock markets, because it's
even gold
before we
and
get
silver?
into that.
I'm sorry, Annie?
Even gold and silver stocks?
I wouldn't, well, in the long run, those are probably okay, but I don't know that, our data shows that the markets themselves are at risk. That is to say, the ability to trade paper back and forth will be at risk as we go through fall. So I'm not a big fan of the stock market as it exists now, because the gold and silver stocks these days are not like the gold and silver stocks in the previous depression.
Oh, really? How are they different, Clif?
Well, the stock market is different, basically. In the previous depression, we were still operating under the short-term or the short feed line, where you could invest in a company through the stock and that company would actually put your money to work in their mines or their factory somehow, right? As they sold more stock, they had more cash, they'd hire more employees, etc. It no longer works that way. There's been such a huge level of corruption that just to get your stock listed, you have this